Sometimes, the hardest person to help is the one who spent a lifetime helping others. For 73-year-old Henry Lathrop, asking for assistance feels like admitting defeat after 50 years of running his Vermont farm alone. When his beloved draft horse Daisy starts limping, Henry tells himself she's just getting old like him. For months, he watches her struggle, hoping time will heal whatever's wrong. His daughter Sarah finally calls young vet Caleb against Henry's wishes. What Caleb finds buried deep in Daisy's hoof surprises everyone. The discovery leads to something neither man expected, a friendship that changes them both. Henry learns that accepting help isn't weakness, and Caleb discovers that experience comes in many forms. But what was really causing Daisy's pain all those months? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clings to the rolling hills of Vermont like a gentle embrace, and Henry Lathrop moves through it with the steady rhythm of a man who has walked these same paths for half a century. At 73, his back bears the honest curve of decades spent bent over crops. His hands carry the permanent stains of soil and honest work, and his weathered face tells the story of every season he's weathered on this 100-acre farm. The old barn stands like a cathedral in the early light, its hand-hewn beams installed by Henry's grandfather, more than a century ago, still bearing the weight of time and memory. Inside, mounted on the wall near the main stall, hangs his father's collection of horseshoes, each one polished to a dull shine and arranged with the care of a man who understood that some things deserve reverence. These horseshoes represent more than mere farm equipment. They carry the weight of 3 generations of Lathrop men who worked this land with their hands and their hearts. Henry pauses at Daisy's stall, as he has every morning for the past 12 years. The Belgian draft horse stands 18 hands high, her coat the color of burnished copper and the filtered sunlight streaming through the barn's east-facing windows. Her broad back has carried countless loads of hay. Her powerful legs have pulled the old plow through spring fields when the tractor couldn't manage the muddy corners. And her gentle nature has been Henry's constant companion through the loneliest years following Martha's passing. "Morning, girl," Henry murmurs, his voice carrying the soft cadence of a man who speaks more often to animals than to people these days. Daisy turns her massive head toward him, her dark eyes reflecting intelligence that never fails to move him. But this morning, something's different. As she shifts her weight, Henry notices the slight hesitation, the way she favors her left front hoof, just enough to catch his practiced eye. He runs his hand along her neck, feeling the warmth of her coat and the solid reassurance of her presence. "Just getting old, aren't we, Daisy?" he says, more to himself than to the horse. The words carry a weight he doesn't want to acknowledge, the recognition that time spares no one, not even the strongest. Among them, the farm spreads out around them in a patchwork of fields that Henry knows like the lines on his own palms. 20 acres of corn that will feed his small herd of cattle through the winter, 15 acres of hay that Daisy helps him harvest each August, and the remaining 65 acres of pasture where his dozen head of Holstein dairy cows graze in. Contentment. It's not a large operation by modern standards, but it's sustainable, manageable, and it's been home to 3 generations of Lathrops. Henry's daily routine unfolds with the precision of a well-wound clock. Feed the chickens first. Martha always insisted the ladies came first, and he's maintained that tradition in her honor. Check the cattle, repair whatever fence the weather or time has damaged, tend to the dozen tasks that accumulate on a working farm like snow in a Vermont winter. But today, as every day for the past several weeks, his eyes keep returning to Daisy's subtle limp. The coffee pot in the farmhouse kitchen still brews the same strong blend that Martha preferred, and Henry drinks it from the same blue ceramic mug she gave him on their 10th wedding anniversary. The kitchen itself bears the marks of a woman's touch curtains she sewed 40 years ago, still hanging straight and clean, and the small herb garden visible through the window that she planted and he's maintained with religious devotion. Sarah calls every Tuesday and Friday, her voice carrying across the miles from her home in Montpelier with the concern of a daughter who worries about her aging father. She's a good woman, raised 2 fine children of her own, and manages a small accounting firm with the same practical wisdom that Martha possessed. But she doesn't understand the rhythm of farm life, the way problems often resolve themselves if given time and patience. "Dad, you need to have someone look at Daisy's leg," she'd said during last week's call, her voice carrying that particular tone children use when they believe they know better than their parents. "She's just getting old, Sarah, same as me. We worked through it. That's exactly what I'm worried about. When's the last time you saw Dr. Peterson?" Henry had changed the subject, as he always did when Sarah tried to manage his health the way she managed her business accounts. Some things couldn't be balanced with spreadsheets and logic. Some things required the patience that only comes from understanding that bodies, human and animal, have their own wisdom about healing. But as the weeks passed, Daisy's condition hadn't improved. If anything, the limp had become more pronounced, especially in the mornings when the Vermont chill settled into aging joints. Henry found himself modifying their routines, asking less of her, taking on more of the physical work himself, even when his own body protested. The irony wasn't lost on him, a man who spent his life caring for animals but refused to acknowledge his own need for care. His knees creaked when he rose from bed each morning. His shoulder ached where he'd dislocated it 20 years ago in a fall from the hayloft. And his back reminded him daily of the thousands of bales he'd lifted, the countless hours bent over crops, the decades of physical labor that had shaped both his character and his body. Martha would have insisted he call the veterinarian weeks ago. She possessed the practical wisdom to know when stubborn independence crossed the line into foolish pride. "Henry Lathrop," she would have said, hands on her hips in that way that meant business. "That horse has given you 12 years of faithful service. The least you can do is give her the care she deserves." But Martha had been gone for 5 years now, and Henry had grown comfortable with his solitary decision-making. No one to question his judgment, no one to suggest that perhaps his way wasn't always the right way, no one to remind him that asking for help didn't diminish a lifetime of self-reliance. The morning chores complete, Henry stands in the barn doorway watching Daisy move carefully around her paddock. The sight of her obvious discomfort finally penetrates the wall of denial he's built around the situation. This magnificent animal, who has never complained, never shirked her duties, never given him anything but loyal service, deserves better. Then his stubborn pride. He thinks of the horseshoes on the wall, of his father's steady hands shoeing horses with the confidence that comes from knowledge and experience. He thinks of his grandfather's beams, still holding strong after more than a century, because they were built to last, built to support weight, built to endure. Perhaps Henry realizes with the slow dawning of uncomfortable truth. Strength sometimes comes not from standing alone, but from knowing when to accept the support of others. The decision forms slowly, like morning mist lifting from the fields. It's time to swallow his pride and get help for Daisy. But even as the thought takes shape, Henry feels the familiar resistance, the voice that has guided him through 5 decades of farming. Handle your own problems. Don't be a burden. Figure it out yourself. As he closes the barn door and heads toward the house, Henry Lathrop carries the weight of a decision he's not quite ready to make. Behind him, Daisy watches through the paddock fence, her intelligent eyes holding a trust that Henry prays he won't disappoint. 3 weeks later, on a crisp October morning, when the maples blaze scarlet against a crystal blue sky, Henry's carefully maintained world began to crumble around the edges. Daisy could barely put weight on her left front hoof, and even Henry's Stubborn optimism couldn't explain away the obvious pain etched in every careful step she took. The old black rotary phone in Henry's kitchen had witnessed 5 decades of farm business calls to the feed store, conversations with neighbors about shared equipment, and the daily check-ins with Martha's sister before she passed. The phone represented connection to a simpler time when problems were solved with handshakes and honest conversation, not complicated contracts and automated systems. This morning, that phone seemed to mock him with its silence, a reminder of the call he knew he should make but couldn't bring himself to dial. Henry stood at the kitchen window, watching Daisy through the glass as she stood motionless in the paddock, her head hanging low in a posture that spoke of defeat. The sight cut through him like a blade. In all their years together, he had never seen her look so diminished, so vulnerable. The proud horse who had pulled his plow through countless spring plantings, who had hauled hay wagons with the steady determination of a locomotive, now looked like what she was, an aging animal in pain. The sound of tires on gravel interrupted his brooding. Through the window, he watched Sarah's blue sedan navigate the familiar ruts of his driveway, and his heart sank. Tuesday wasn't one of her regular calling days, which meant she was coming unannounced, and Sarah only made unannounced visits when she was prepared for battle. She emerged from the car wearing the expression Henry recognized from her childhood, the look that meant she had made up her mind about something and wouldn't be swayed by his arguments. At 47, Sarah carried herself with the confident bearing of a woman who had learned to navigate a man's world through competence and determination. Her auburn hair, so much like Martha's, was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore the kind of sensible clothes that could transition from office to farm without missing a beat. "Dad," she said without preamble as she stepped onto the porch, "we need to talk about Daisy." Henry felt his defenses rise like hackles on a threatened dog. "Good morning to you too, Sarah. Coffee's fresh if you want some. Don't." Her voice carried the firmness that had made her successful in business and effective as a mother. "Don't deflect, and don't pretend you don't know why I'm here. Mrs. Henderson called me yesterday. She said she drove past the farm and saw Daisy standing in the paddock, barely moving. She said it looked like the horse was suffering." The words hit Henry like physical blows. Eleanor Henderson had been Martha's closest friend, a woman whose judgment Henry respected even when it stung. If Eleanor thought Daisy was suffering, then perhaps his own assessment had been clouded by wishful thinking and stubborn pride. "Daisy's just having a rough morning," Henry said, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. "Sometimes the cold weather makes her stiff." Sarah walked past him toward the paddock, and Henry followed, dreading what he knew she would see. Daisy stood exactly where she had been an hour ago, favoring her injured hoof with such obvious distress that even someone unfamiliar with horses couldn't miss it. "Dad." Sarah's voice was gentler now, filled with the kind of compassion that made Henry's throat tighten. "Look at her. Really, look at her." Henry forced himself to see what he had been avoiding for weeks. Daisy's coat, usually gleaming with health, looked dull and rough. Her eyes, normally bright with curiosity and intelligence, seemed clouded with constant pain. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, and when she shifted her weight, she did so with the careful, tentative movements of someone expecting agony. "She's been like this for how long?" Sarah asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer would disappoint her. "A few weeks, maybe a month." Henry's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "A month?" The word cracked like a whip. "Dad, you've let that beautiful animal suffer for a month because you're too proud to pick up the phone?" The accusation hung between them like a physical presence. Henry wanted to defend himself, to explain about patience and natural healing, about the wisdom of letting time work its magic. But standing there, looking at Daisy's obvious distress, all his arguments crumbled into dust. "I thought she'd work through it," he said finally. The admission feeling like defeat. Like you always work through everything? Like you worked through the pneumonia last winter without seeing a doctor until I threatened to call an ambulance? Like you're working through the arthritis in your hands that makes you wince every time you think I'm not looking? Sarah's words came fast and hard, years of worry and frustration pouring out in a torrent. Dad, I love you. I respect everything you've accomplished, everything you've built here. But your pride is going to kill you, and apparently it's going to kill Daisy first. Henry felt something break inside his chest. Not his heart, exactly, but something close to it. The careful wall he had built around his independence, his self-reliance, his determination to handle everything alone. For the first time since Martha's death, he felt truly helpless. I don't know any veterinarians around here anymore, he said, the admission feeling like pulling teeth. Old Doc Williams retired 5 years ago, and I haven't needed. There's a young vet in Brattleboro, Sarah interrupted, pulling out her phone. Caleb Morrison. He's been treating the Hendersons' horses for 2 years. Eleanor says he's thorough and kind. The word young made Henry's stomach clench. He pictured some fresh-faced college graduate with book knowledge, but no practical experience. Someone who would charge a fortune to tell him what he already knew, that animals get old, and sometimes there's nothing to be done about it. Sarah, I can't afford to throw money at. Stop. She held up her hand. Just stop. I'm calling him, and I'm paying for it. And you're going to let him examine Daisy because it's the right thing to do. Henry wanted to argue, wanted to assert his authority as both the farm owner and Sarah's father. But looking at Daisy, seeing the trust in her eyes despite her pain, he found he couldn't form the words. This animal had given him everything, her strength, her companionship, her unwavering loyalty. The least he could do was swallow his pride long enough to get her the help she needed. Fine, he said, the word coming out like a sigh of surrender. But I'm paying for it myself. Sarah was already dialing, her fingers moving across the phone screen with practiced efficiency. Dr. Morrison, this is Sarah Williams. I need to schedule an emergency visit for my father's horse. As Henry listened to his daughter make arrangements he should have made weeks ago, he felt the weight of his own stubbornness settling around him like a heavy coat. For 50 years, he had prided himself on solving his own problems, on never being a burden to anyone. But somewhere along the way, that independence had hardened into something less admirable, a pride that put his own comfort above the welfare of those who depended on him. The appointment was scheduled for the following afternoon, 24 hours to prepare himself for the humiliation of admitting he needed help, 24 hours to brace for whatever the young veterinarian might find, 24 hours to hope that his delay hadn't cost Daisy more than either of them could afford to lose. 20 miles south in Brattleboro, Dr. Caleb Morrison closed his veterinary textbook and rubbed his tired eyes. At 28, he possessed all the academic credentials needed to treat farm animals. But academic knowledge and practical experience were two different creatures entirely. His well-worn leather veterinary bag sat beside his desk, filled with instruments and medications that represented years of study and thousands of dollars in student loans. Yet he still felt like an imposter every time he drove out to treat a farmer's livestock. Caleb had grown up in Burlington, the son of a college professor and a librarian, more familiar with coffee shops and bookstores than barns and pastures. His decision to specialize in large animal veterinary medicine had surprised everyone, including himself. But during his clinical rotations, something about the honest relationship between farmers and their animals had called to him in a way that small animal practice never could. The phone call from Sarah Williams had come at the end of a long day, spent treating a colicky horse and vaccinating a herd of cattle for a dairy operation outside town. When she mentioned her father's Belgian draft horse, Caleb felt the familiar flutter of nervousness that accompanied calls involving old-time farmers. These men had been working with animals longer than Caleb had been alive, and they possessed an intuitive understanding of livestock that no textbook could teach. He spent the evening researching draft horse lameness, reviewing everything from navicular disease to founder, trying to anticipate what might be causing the animal's distress. His laptop screen glowed in the darkness of his small apartment as he studied anatomical diagrams and treatment protocols, desperate to appear competent when he faced Henry Lathrop the following day. Meanwhile, 15 miles north, Henry lay awake in the bed he had shared with Martha for 37 years, staring at the ceiling and listening to the old house settle around him. Through the open window, he could hear the soft sounds of the farm at night, the distant lowing of cattle, the rustle of wind through the maple trees, and somewhere in the darkness, Daisy's occasional movement in her stall. Sleep eluded him as his mind churned through decades of memories. He remembered the day he had brought Daisy home as a 4-year-old, barely broken to harness, her copper coat gleaming in the spring sunshine. Martha had fallen in love with the horse immediately, declaring her the most beautiful animal she had ever seen. "She's got kind eyes," Martha had said, running her hand along Daisy's neck. And kind eyes never lie. Henry thought about all the times Daisy had pulled him out of difficult situations, literally and figuratively. The spring when the tractor broke down during planting season, and Daisy had pulled the old plow through 40 acres of fields without complaint. The winter when a snowstorm knocked out power for 3 days, and Daisy had helped him drag hay bales to the cattle through drifts that came up to Henry's chest. The lonely months after Martha's funeral, when Daisy's presence in the barn provided the only companionship that didn't require explanations or polite conversation. Now, lying in the darkness, Henry was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. His reluctance to call the veterinarian had nothing to do with money or practicality. It stemmed from something deeper and more troubling: his fear that Daisy's condition might be beyond help. That calling the vet might mean facing the possibility of losing her Dot at 73. Henry had buried his parents, his wife, and many friends to count. He understood the rhythm of loss that accompanied aging, the way death carved away pieces of your world until you wondered if anything permanent remained. Daisy represented continuity in a life that had seen too much change, and the thought of losing her felt like losing the last connection to the life he and Martha had built together. The morning arrived gray and drizzly, with the kind of persistent Vermont rain that seeps into your bones and makes everything feel more difficult. Henry completed his morning chores with unusual attention to detail, checking and rechecking the barn, organizing tools that didn't need organizing, anything to keep his hands busy while his mind raced with worry. Sarah arrived at 11:30, carrying a thermos of coffee and wearing the determined expression that meant she intended to see this through to the end. She had taken the afternoon off work, something she rarely did, and Henry understood that this was her way of showing support while ensuring he didn't change his mind at the last minute. "How's she doing this morning?" Sarah asked, nodding toward Daisy's stall. "About the same." Henry's voice carried the weight of a sleepless night. "Maybe a little worse." They stood together watching Daisy, who remained motionless except for the occasional shift of weight away from her injured hoof. The sight of her obvious discomfort settled over them like a heavy blanket, and Henry felt his daughter's presence as both comfort and reproach. At 12:15, a white pickup truck with Morrison Veterinary Services painted on the side turned into the driveway. Henry's stomach clenched as he watched a young man emerge from the vehicle, tall and lean, with sandy brown hair and the kind of earnest expression that suggested he took his responsibilities seriously. The veterinarian wore clean coveralls and moved with the careful confidence of someone who had learned to mask nervousness with professional demeanor. Caleb Morrison approached the farmhouse with his medical bag in one hand and a clipboard in the other. taking in the details of the operation with the appreciative eye of someone who understood what it took to maintain a working farm. The barn was old but well maintained. The fences were straight and secure, and everything suggested the steady hand of an experienced farmer. "Mr. Lathrop?" Caleb extended his hand with a firm grip and a direct gaze. "I'm Dr. Morrison. Thank you for calling." Henry shook the offered hand, noting the softness of skin that hadn't spent decades handling rough tools and stubborn animals. But the young man's eyes were steady and kind, and something in his manner reminded Henry of his own grandson Ernest, well-meaning and trying perhaps a little too hard to prove himself. "Appreciate you coming out," Henry said, though the words felt like admitting defeat. "Sarah thought it might be worth having someone take a look." "I understand your horse has been favoring her left front," Caleb said, consulting his notes. "How long has this been going on?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, and Henry felt Sarah's eyes on him. "A few weeks," he said finally, the admission feeling like stepping off a cliff. Caleb nodded without judgment, though Henry thought he detected a slight tightening around the young man's eyes. "Let's take a look at her, shall we?" As they walked toward the barn, Henry found himself studying the veterinarian's profile, looking for signs of the arrogance or condescension he had expected from someone so young. Instead, he saw concentration and what appeared to be genuine concern. Perhaps, Henry thought with surprise, this wouldn't be quite the ordeal he had anticipated. Inside the barn, Daisy stood in her stall with the patient resignation of an animal accustomed to human attention. Caleb approached slowly, speaking in the low, soothing tones that experienced veterinarians learn to use around nervous livestock. Henry watched from the stall door, his arms crossed over his chest in a posture that Sarah recognized as defensive. "She's a beautiful horse," Caleb said, running his hands along Daisy's neck and shoulder with practiced gentleness. "Belgian?" "That's right. 12 years old come spring." Henry's voice carried a note of pride despite his anxiety. Caleb worked methodically, checking Daisy's pulse, listening to her heart and lungs, examining her eyes and mouth with the thoroughness of someone who understood that lameness often had systemic causes. Henry found himself impressed despite his reservations. The young veterinarian's movements were confident and deliberate, and Daisy responded to his touch with calm acceptance. "Our vital signs are good," Caleb said, moving to examine the affected leg. "Let's see what's going on with this hoof." As Caleb lifted Daisy's left front leg, the horse flinched and tried to pull away, a reaction that made Henry's stomach clench with guilt. The veterinarian held firm but gentle, supporting the massive hoof while he probed the sole and frog with careful fingers. "There's definitely heat here," Caleb murmured, more to himself than to his audience. "And she's tender right around this area." He pointed to a spot on the sole that looked no different to Henry than any other part of the hoof. On the wall near Daisy's stall, Martha's old gardening gloves hung from a nail where Henry had placed them 5 years ago and never moved. They were simple canvas gloves, stained with soil and worn thin at the fingertips, but they represented something precious to Henry, the memory of partnership, of shared labor, of two people working together toward common goals. Martha had worn those gloves while tending her vegetable garden, while helping with hay season, while doing the 1,000 small tasks that kept the farm running smoothly. "I need to clean this hoof thoroughly and get a better look," Caleb said, straightening up. "The initial examination suggests there might be something embedded in the sole, but I'll need proper tools and better lighting to be certain." Henry felt his jaw tighten. What kind of tools? Hoof testers, a proper knife for cleaning, maybe some radiographic equipment if we need to see what's happening inside. Caleb's tone was matter-of-fact, but Henry heard the underlying message. This wasn't going to be a simple, inexpensive fix. "Radiographic equipment?" Sarah stepped forward. "You mean X-rays?" "Possibly. If there's a foreign object embedded deeply enough, Imaging might be the only way to locate it precisely. Caleb looked between Henry and Sarah, clearly reading the tension in the barn. I know it sounds like a lot, but if something's been lodged in there for weeks or months, we need to know exactly what we're dealing with. Henry's mind raced through calculations he couldn't afford to make. X-rays meant traveling to Caleb's clinic, meant specialized equipment, meant costs that could easily run into hundreds of dollars. The farm operated on thin margins in the best of times, and this year's hay crop had been lighter than usual due to the summer drought. How much are we talking about? Henry asked, the words coming out rougher than he intended. Caleb hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the financial discussion. The examination and basic treatment might run $200 to $300. If we need imaging and more complex intervention, it could be more. The silence in the barn stretched like a taut wire. Henry stared at Daisy, watching her shift carefully from hoof to hoof, her pain evident in every movement. $300 represented nearly a month of grocery money, or the cost of winter feed for the chickens, or any number of farm expenses that couldn't be delayed. Dad, Sarah's voice was gentle but firm. I meant what I said yesterday. I'm paying for this. No. The word came out sharper than Henry intended. This is my farm, my horse, my responsibility. And my father, Sarah replied, matching his stubborn tone. And my inheritance someday, if you want to be practical about it. Taking care of Daisy is taking care of the farm. Caleb cleared his throat diplomatically. Why don't we start with a thorough cleaning and examination? Once I can see what we're dealing with, we'll have a better idea of the treatment options and costs. Henry studied the young veterinarian's face, looking for signs of the calculation he expected, the decision about how much effort to invest based on the client's ability to pay. Instead, he saw genuine concern for Daisy's welfare and professional curiosity about the case. Martha would have called you weeks ago, Henry said quietly, the admission surprising everyone in the barn, including himself. Tell me about Martha, Caleb said, settling into a more comfortable position beside Daisy's stall. My wife, passed 5 years ago come December. Henry's voice carried the weight of grief that time had softened but never eliminated. She had a way of knowing when something needed attention, whether it was a sick calf or a loose fence board or a stubborn husband who wouldn't admit he was wrong. Sarah moved closer to her father, her hand finding his arm in a gesture of comfort. Mom always said the animals depend on us to speak for them when they're hurting. She was right about that, Caleb said. Animals have their own ways of communicating pain, but they can't tell us specifically what's wrong or how long it's been bothering them. That's our job. Henry looked at Martha's gloves hanging on the wall, remembering her gentle hands and practical wisdom. She would have seen through his excuses and rationalizations weeks ago. She would have reminded him that caring for those who depend on you isn't a burden. It's a privilege. All right, Henry said, the words feeling like stepping across a threshold he couldn't uncross. Let's find out what's wrong with her. Caleb smiled, the first genuinely relaxed expression Henry had seen from him. I'll need to get some equipment from my truck. Is there somewhere with good lighting where we can work? The main aisle has overhead lights, Henry said. And there's electrical outlets if you need them. As Caleb headed toward his truck, Sarah touched her father's arm again. You're doing the right thing, Dad. Henry nodded, though he still felt like he was betraying 50 years of self-reliance. But watching Daisy's careful movements, seeing the trust in her dark eyes despite her pain, he knew that some betrayals were necessary. Some forms of pride were too expensive to maintain. 2 days later, Caleb returned with equipment that looked more suited to a hospital than a barn. The portable X-ray machine, digital hoof testers, and specialized examination lights transformed Henry's familiar workspace into something that felt foreign and intimidating. Above them, the barn's hand-hewn beams installed by Henry's grandfather more than a century ago seemed to watch over this marriage of old world craftsmanship, and modern technology. Those massive chestnut beams had supported the weight of countless hay seasons, witnessed the birth of dozens of calves, and provided shelter for 3 generations of farm animals. They represented endurance, strength, built to last, and the kind of solid foundation that could bear whatever load was placed upon it. As Henry watched Caleb arrange his modern equipment beneath those ancient timbers, he felt the weight of tradition and progress meeting in his barn. "I've never seen anything like this," Henry admitted, watching Caleb calibrate the portable X-ray unit. "In my day, the vet looked at your animal, maybe felt around a bit, and told you what he thought was wrong." "There's still a lot of that," Caleb said, adjusting the machine's settings. "But technology helps us see things that hands alone might miss, especially when we're dealing with something that's been causing problems for an extended period." The mild reproach in his words wasn't lost on Henry, though the young veterinarian delivered it without judgment. Sarah sat on an overturned bucket near Daisy's stall, her presence both moral support and insurance that Henry wouldn't change his mind at the last minute. "This might seem excessive for a farm horse," Caleb continued, "but Daisy's worth the effort. Belgian drafts can work well into their 20s with proper care. She could have another decade of productive life ahead of her." The idea that Daisy might live and work for another 10 years hit Henry with unexpected force. He had been thinking of her as an aging animal approaching the end of her usefulness. But Caleb's perspective reframed everything. 10 more years of companionship, 10 more seasons of shared work, 10 more years of the steady presence that had anchored his life since Martha's death. "What exactly are you looking for?" Henry asked as Caleb prepared the equipment for Daisy's examination. "Foreign objects, fractures, abscesses, signs of infection, anything that might explain the persistent lameness." Caleb's hands moved with practiced efficiency as he prepared the sedation that would keep Daisy calm during the procedure. The fact that this has been going on for weeks suggests something more than simple bruising or a stone that worked its way out. Henry watched the veterinarian work, noting the gentle way Caleb spoke to Daisy, the careful attention to her comfort, the professional competence that had nothing to do with age or experience level. Perhaps, Henry thought, wisdom came in different forms than he had always assumed. The sedation took effect gradually, and Daisy's head lowered as the medication relaxed her nervous system. Caleb positioned the X-ray equipment with meticulous care, explaining each step to Henry and Sarah as he worked. "We'll start with lateral views," he said, then move to different angles if we need more detail. The first X-ray images appeared on Caleb's tablet screen with startling clarity. Henry found himself leaning forward, trying to make sense of the ghostly outlines of bone and tissue that represented Daisy's hoof structure. To him, it looked like abstract art, but Caleb studied the images with the focused intensity of someone reading a familiar language. "There," Caleb said, pointing to a bright spot on the screen. "Do you see that?" Henry squinted at the image, trying to see what had captured the veterinarian's attention. "The white area?" "Exactly. That's a metallic foreign object, embedded pretty deeply in the sole." Caleb manipulated the image, zooming in and adjusting the contrast. "It's been there long enough for the surrounding tissue to form a kind of capsule around it." Sarah moved closer to look at the screen. "What kind of metal?" "Object? Hard to say without removing it, but based on the shape and size, I'd guess it's a nail or a piece of wire." Caleb saved the images to his tablet and began preparing for the next phase of the examination. The good news is that it doesn't appear to have penetrated any major structures. The bad news is that it's going to require minor surgery to remove. The word surgery hit Henry like a physical blow. In his experience, surgery meant risk, expense, and uncertain outcomes. He thought of Daisy under anesthesia, vulnerable and dependent on machines and medications, and his stomach clenched with worry. "How risky is it?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Any procedure carries some risk," Caleb said honestly. "But this is relatively straightforward. We'll use local anesthesia to numb the area, remove the foreign object, clean out any infected tissue, and bandage the wound. She should be walking normally within a few weeks. And if we don't do the surgery," Caleb's expression grew serious, "the object will continue to cause pain and inflammation. Eventually, it could lead to a serious infection that might require more radical treatment or could threaten her life." Henry felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders like a heavy yoke. This beautiful animal, who had given him 12 years of faithful service, was depending on him to make the right choice. The cost would strain his budget. The procedure carried risks. But the alternative was watching Daisy suffer until the situation became desperate. "Dad," Sarah said quietly, "what would Mom have done?" The question cut straight to the heart of Henry's conflict. Martha would have scheduled the surgery immediately, would have found a way to pay for it, would have put Daisy's welfare above financial concerns or fear of the unknown. Martha had possessed the practical wisdom to know that delaying difficult decisions only made them more difficult. "She would have told me to stop being a fool and help this horse," Henry said, the words feeling like both surrender and liberation. Caleb nodded with obvious relief. "I can schedule the procedure for tomorrow morning if that works for you. The sooner we address this, the better." "Tomorrow morning," Henry repeated, the commitment feeling momentous. "What do I need to do to prepare?" As Caleb explained the pre-surgical instructions, Henry found himself looking up at his grandfather's beams again. Those massive timbers had been chosen for their strength, their ability to bear weight without breaking. Perhaps, Henry thought, accepting help wasn't a sign of weakness, perhaps. It was a way of building the kind of support structure that could last for generations. That evening, Henry found himself in the barn long after the sun had set, sitting on his old wooden milking stool beside Daisy's stall. The three-legged stool was a relic from the days when he had milked by hand, crafted from maple wood 40 years ago when his joints were younger and his back was straight. He had shaped each leg carefully, sanded the seat smooth, and finished it with linseed oil that still gleamed in the barn's overhead lights. The stool represented simplicity, reliability, and the satisfaction that came from creating something useful with your own hands. Daisy stood quietly in her stall, occasionally shifting her weight or nickering softly in response to Henry's voice. He found himself talking to her, as he had in the lonely months following Martha's death, sharing thoughts and fears that he couldn't voice to another human being. "Tomorrow's going to be hard, girl," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "For both of us." The barn around them held the accumulated warmth of decades, the sweet smell of hay, the earthy scent of well-maintained stalls, and the indefinable aroma of honest work and animal contentment. These familiar smells usually comforted Henry, but tonight they seemed charged with anxiety about what morning would bring. The sound of tires on gravel interrupted his solitude. Through the barn window, Henry saw headlights approaching the farmhouse, not Sarah's sedan, but the white pickup truck that belonged to Dr. Morrison. Henry checked his watch. 8:30, well past normal business hours. Caleb emerged from his truck carrying a small cooler and wearing the kind of apologetic expression that suggested he was aware of the intrusion. Henry met him at the barn door, curiosity overriding his initial irritation at the unexpected visit. "Dr. Morrison, is everything all right?" "I'm sorry to bother you so late," Caleb said, holding up the cooler. "I brought some pre-surgical medication for Daisy, and I wanted to check on both of you before tomorrow." The unexpected consideration touched Henry in a way he didn't expect. In his experience, professionals did their jobs during business hours and went home to their own concerns. The idea that this young veterinarian was thinking about Daisy and about him outside of normal working hours suggested a level of care that Henry hadn't anticipated. "That's thoughtful of you," Henry said, stepping aside to let Caleb enter. The barn, though I have to admit, I'm a little surprised to see you here so late." Caleb set the cooler down and approached Daisy's stall with the same gentle demeanor he had shown during the day. Large animal practice is different from small animal work. When you're dealing with horses and cattle, you become part of the farm family in a way. Tomorrow's a big day for Daisy, and I wanted to make sure we're all prepared. Henry watched. Caleb examined Daisy one more time, checking her temperature and pulse, assessing her overall condition with the thoroughness of someone who took his responsibilities seriously. The young man's dedication was evident in every movement, and Henry found his initial skepticism giving way to something approaching respect. "Can I ask you something, Dr. Morrison?" "Caleb, please. And of course, what made you want to work with farm animals? You seem like you could have made more money in a small animal practice in town." Caleb smiled, leaning against the stall door in a relaxed posture that suggested he was comfortable with the question. "My grandfather had a small farm outside Burlington. Nothing like this place, just a few acres and some chickens and goats. But I spent summers there as a kid, and I loved the connection between the animals and the land, the way everything worked together." "Your grandfather still farming?" "He passed when I was in college. The land got sold to developers." Caleb's voice carried a note of sadness. "I guess working with farmers like you helps me feel connected to that part of my life." The honesty in the young man's response surprised Henry. He had expected the usual professional platitudes about loving animals and wanting to help, but Caleb's answer revealed something deeper, a search for connection, for meaning, for a way to honor memory through service. "What would your grandfather think about tomorrow's procedure?" Henry asked. "He would have done exactly what you're doing." He was the kind of man who believed that taking care of animals was a sacred responsibility. Caleb paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. "He also taught me that asking for help isn't admitting weakness, it's admitting wisdom." The words hit Henry with unexpected force. Here was this young man, barely half his age, articulating truths that Henry had been struggling to accept for months. Perhaps wisdom really did come in different forms than he had always assumed. "I've been farming this land for 50 years, Henry said, settling back onto his milking stool. "Built most of this operation with my own hands, solved most problems without calling for help. But watching Daisy suffer because of my pride, that's not wisdom, that's just stubbornness." "There's a difference between independence and isolation," Caleb said. "Your independence built this farm, raised your family, created something lasting. But isolation would have let Daisy suffer unnecessarily." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, two men from different generations finding common ground in their shared concern for an aging horse. The barn's overhead lights cast long shadows between the stalls, and the familiar sounds of the farm at night, cattle lowing in the distance, the rustle of hay, the creak of old wood settling created a peaceful backdrop for their conversation. "I'm scared," Henry admitted, the words surprising him with their honesty. "Not just about the surgery, but about what comes after. I'm getting old, Dr. Morrison Caleb. My joints ache in the morning. My back isn't what it used to be, and sometimes I wonder how much longer I can keep this place running." 73 isn't old for a farmer," Caleb said gently. "I have clients in their 80s still working their land. The key is knowing when to accept help and when to adapt. Like calling the vet when your horse is lame. Exactly like that." As Caleb prepared to leave, he handed Henry a business card with his personal cell phone number written on the back. "Call me if you have any concerns tonight, no matter how late. And Henry, you're doing the right thing." After the veterinarian's truck disappeared into the darkness, Henry remained in the barn with Daisy, feeling something shift in his understanding of strength and independence. Tomorrow would bring surgery, uncertainty, and the continuation of a journey he was finally ready to take. Surgery day dawned clear and cold, with frost silvering the pastures and the kind of crystalline air that made every sound carry farther than usual. Henry had been awake since 4, moving through his morning chores with the mechanical precision of a man trying to keep his hands busy while his mind raced with worry. Caleb arrived at 7:30 sharp, his truck loaded with surgical equipment and accompanied by a veterinary technician named Lisa who would assist with the procedure. Henry watched them transform a corner of his barn into a sterile surgical suite, laying out instruments with the methodical care of professionals who understood that preparation could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. Sarah arrived shortly after, carrying a thermos of coffee and wearing the determined expression that Henry had learned meant she intended to see this through regardless of his preferences. She busied herself organizing the barn, sweeping areas that didn't need sweeping, and arranging tools that were already properly arranged, anything to channel her nervous energy into productive activity. The pre-surgical sedation took effect gradually, and Daisy's massive head lowered as the medication relaxed her nervous system. Henry stood beside her, one hand resting on her neck, feeling the steady rhythm of her breathing and drawing comfort from her calm acceptance of the situation. "She's ready," Caleb announced, checking Daisy's vital signs one final time. "Henry, you're welcome to stay and watch, but I understand if you prefer to wait outside." "I'll stay," Henry said firmly. "She's been with me through everything else. I'm not leaving her now." The local anesthetic took effect quickly, numbing the area around the embedded object. Caleb worked with steady hands and intense concentration, making careful incisions to access the foreign material that had been causing Daisy's distress for months. "I can see it now," Caleb murmured, using forceps to probe the wound. "It's definitely metallic, and it's worked itself in pretty deeply." Henry found himself holding his breath as the veterinarian worked, each movement deliberate and precise. Sarah stood beside him, her hand finding his arm in a gesture of support that reminded him of Martha's presence during the difficult moments of their life together. "Almost got it," Caleb said, adjusting his grip on the forceps. "This might have been in there longer than we thought." With a final careful movement, Caleb extracted the object that had been causing Daisy's suffering. He held it up to the light, his expression changing from concentration to surprise as he examined what he had removed. "Well, I'll be damned," he said softly, dotting the forceps. Clearly visible despite being darkened by corrosion and tissue was an old horseshoe nail, not the modern galvanized variety used by contemporary farriers, but the traditional iron nail that Henry's generation had used for decades. The head was square and worn, the shaft bent from impact and time, and the entire nail showed the unmistakable patina of age. Henry stared at the object in Caleb's forceps, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. "That's a horseshoe nail. An old one," Caleb confirmed, examining the artifact more closely. "This type hasn't been commonly used for probably 20 years. The modern nails have different heads and better corrosion resistance. But how did it get there?" Sarah asked, though her voice suggested she was beginning to understand the implications. Henry felt the blood drain from his face as the terrible irony of the situation hit him with full force. The nail in Caleb's forceps was exactly the type he had used for 40 years of shoeing his own horses, the same type his father had taught him to use, the same type that filled the coffee can in his workshop where he kept his farrier supplies. "Oh, God," Henry whispered, his voice barely audible. "I did this." The silence in the barn stretched like a taut wire as the full meaning of the discovery settled over them. Henry had shod Daisy himself for most of her life, as he had shod every horse on the farm since he was 20 years old. The nail now lying in Caleb's forceps had almost certainly come from Henry's own hammer, driven into Daisy's hoof during a routine shoeing session, and somehow penetrated too deeply, breaking off beneath the surface where it had remained hidden for months or even years. "Henry," Caleb said gently, "this kind of thing happens more often than you might think. Even experienced farriers occasionally drive a nail that goes slightly off course, but Henry wasn't listening to the young veterinarians. Reassurances. He was remembering the last time he had shod Daisy nearly 2 years ago, when his arthritis was beginning to make the work more difficult, but his pride prevented him from hiring a professional farrier. He had been rushing to finish before a storm hit, working faster than was wise, and he remembered one nail that had seemed to go in harder than the others. "I should have known," Henry said, his voice thick with guilt and self-recrimination. "All these months, watching her suffer, and it was my own damn fault." Sarah moved closer to her father, her voice firm but compassionate. "Dad, you couldn't have known. If the nail broke off beneath the surface, there would have been no way to see it." "Your daughter's right," Caleb added, setting the extracted nail carefully aside. "This type of injury can be completely invisible initially. The nail probably worked its way deeper over time as the hoof grew around it." Henry stared at the rusted nail, seeing in it a symbol of everything that was wrong with his stubborn insistence on handling everything himself. His pride in his farrier skills, his refusal to acknowledge his aging hands and failing eyesight, his determination to save money by doing work that perhaps should have been left to younger, more skilled professionals, all of it had culminated in months of unnecessary suffering for an animal who had never given him anything but loyal service. 50 years of shoeing horses," Henry said, his voice breaking slightly, "and I cripple. The best one I ever owned." "Stop," Sarah said firmly. "You didn't cripple her. You made a mistake that any farrier could have made. The important thing is that we found it and removed it." Caleb was already cleaning the wound, irrigating away the infected tissue and debris that had accumulated around the foreign object. "The good news is that there's no significant damage to the underlying structures. Once this heals, she should be completely sound." But Henry barely heard the reassuring words. He was drowning in a sea of guilt and self-blame, seeing the extracted nail as proof of his failure as a caretaker, as evidence that his stubborn pride had nearly cost Daisy her mobility and possibly her life. The rusted horseshoe nail lay on, a clean towel like an accusation, its corroded surface telling the story of months spent embedded in living tissue, causing daily pain that Daisy had endured with the stoic patience that made horses such extraordinary companions. Henry realized that this small piece of iron represented everything he needed to learn about accepting help, acknowledging limitations, and putting the welfare of those who depended on him above his own pride. As Caleb sutured the wound and applied a protective bandage, Henry stood in stunned silence, processing the profound irony that his own handiwork had caused the very problem he had been too proud to address promptly. The discovery would change everything, not just his relationship with Daisy, but his entire understanding of independence, responsibility, and the courage required to admit when you need help. In the days following the surgery, Henry wrapped himself in guilt like a heavy winter coat, moving through his daily routines with the mechanical precision of a man trying to outrun his own thoughts. The special therapeutic blanket that Caleb had provided for Daisy's recovery lay draped across her back, a soft blue covering, embedded with warming elements that promoted healing and provided comfort during the critical post-surgical period. The blanket represented everything Henry had failed to provide: professional care, modern treatment, and the willingness to seek help when it was needed most. Each time he looked at it, he was reminded of his own inadequacy, his stubborn pride that had prolonged Daisy's suffering for months. Caleb visited twice daily during the first week, checking the surgical site and monitoring Daisy's recovery with the dedicated attention of a physician tending a beloved patient. Henry found these visits simultaneously comforting and torturous, grateful for the professional care, but increasingly aware of how much he had to learn about proper animal husbandry. "The wound is healing beautifully," Caleb announced during a morning visit, unwrapping Daisy's bandage to reveal healthy pink tissue where the infected area had been. No signs of complications, and she's already putting more weight on the hoof. Henry nodded, watching Daisy's improved movement with a mixture of relief and continuing self-recrimination. How long before she's back to normal? Another week or two for complete healing, then we can gradually increase her activity. Caleb rewrapped the hoof with practiced efficiency. But Henry, I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. The serious tone in the young veterinarian's voice made Henry's stomach clench. What is it? When's the last time you had a complete physical? Blood work, blood pressure. Check, the works? The question caught Henry off guard. What does that have to do with Daisy? Nothing directly. But watching you these past few days, I've noticed you favor your right side when you walk. You wince when you think no one's looking, and your hands shake slightly when you're tired. Caleb's voice was gentle but firm. You've been taking care of everyone and everything except yourself. Henry felt his defensive walls rising. I'm fine. Just the usual aches and pains of getting old. That's exactly what you said about Daisy's lameness. Just getting old. Look how that turned out. The parallel hit Henry like a physical blow. He stared at Caleb, seeing in the young man's concerned expression an uncomfortable mirror of his own situation. Just as he had dismissed Daisy's pain as inevitable aging, he had been ignoring his own declining health, convincing himself that stoic endurance was preferable to medical intervention. I haven't seen a doctor in probably 5 years, Henry admitted reluctantly. 5 years? Caleb's eyebrows rose. Henry, you're 73 years old. You should be having annual checkups, monitoring your blood pressure, checking your cholesterol levels, screening for the kinds of problems that are treatable if caught early. Sarah, who had been quietly observing from the corner of the barn, stepped forward. I've been telling him the same thing for years. He's as stubborn about his own health as he was about Daisy's. And look how well that worked out, Henry said bitterly, gesturing toward the healing horse. Exactly my point, Caleb replied. The same wisdom that finally convinced you to help Daisy should apply to helping yourself. Henry felt cornered, trapped by logic he couldn't refute and concern he couldn't dismiss. The parallels between his situation and Daisy's were too obvious to ignore, too compelling to argue against. If his pride had nearly cost Daisy her mobility, what might his medical neglect cost him? What would Martha say? Sarah asked quietly, employing the same question that had finally broken through Henry's resistance regarding Daisy's treatment. Henry closed his eyes, hearing his wife's voice as clearly as if she were standing beside him. Martha had nagged him about doctor visits for 40 years, scheduling appointments he would postpone, reminding him about tests he would avoid, worrying about symptoms he would dismiss. Her death from cancer had been particularly cruel because it had come despite her. Religious attention to medical care, annual mammograms, regular checkups, immediate attention to any concerning symptoms. She would have dragged me to the doctor. By my ear, Henry said, a sad smile crossing his weathered face. Then let's honor her memory by making that appointment, Sarah said, pulling out her phone. Dr. Peterson is still practicing, and I'm calling him right now. Henry wanted to protest, to assert his independence, to maintain the fiction that he was fine and needed no one's help. But looking at Daisy in her recovery blanket, seeing the evidence of what happened when pride overruled wisdom, he found he couldn't form the words of resistance. All right, he said, the surrender feeling both terrifying and liberating. Make the appointment? As Sarah dialed Dr. Peterson's office, Caleb continued his examination of Daisy, his hands gentle and thorough as he checked her overall condition. You know, he said conversationally, some of my most successful clients are farmers in their 80s who've learned to balance independence with smart healthcare. What do you mean? They still run their operations, still make their own decisions, still maintain their autonomy. But they also get regular checkups, take medications when they need them, and ask for help when it's appropriate. Caleb straightened up, meeting Henry's eyes directly. Real independence isn't about never needing help. It's about being healthy and capable enough to make your own choices. The concept was revolutionary to Henry's way of thinking. For 73 years, he had equated independence with isolation, self-reliance with self-denial. The idea that accepting help could actually preserve independence rather than diminish it required a fundamental shift in his worldview. "Your appointment is next Tuesday at 10, Sarah announced, ending her phone call. "Dr. Peterson wants to do a complete work of blood tests, EKG, the whole examination." Henry nodded, feeling like he was stepping off a cliff into unknown territory. "What should I expect?" "Probably some lectures about diet and exercise," Caleb said with a grin. "Maybe some medications for blood pressure or cholesterol. Possibly some recommendations for lifestyle changes. Nothing you can't handle." Over the following days, word of Daisy's surgery spread through the farming community with the speed that news travels in rural areas. Neighbors began stopping by, some ostensibly to check on Daisy's recovery. Others, clearly motivated by curiosity about the young veterinarian who had gained Henry Lathrop's trust. Eleanor Henderson arrived with a casserole and stayed for coffee, sharing stories about her own horse's medical issues and praising Caleb's skill and dedication. Tom Morrison from the dairy operation down the valley stopped by to ask about Caleb's availability for his cattle, mentioning that word was spreading about the thorough job he had done on Henry's horse. Each visitor reinforced the same message. Seeking professional help when needed wasn't a sign of weakness or failure. It was practical wisdom that experienced farmers had always practiced. Henry began to realize that his isolation had been self-imposed, that the farming community had always supported its members through difficult times. "You know what's funny?" Henry said to Caleb during one of his evening checkups. "I thought calling you would make me look weak or incompetent. Instead, everyone's treating me like I finally showed some sense." "Because you did," Caleb replied simply. "And your willingness to get help for Daisy has probably encouraged other farmers to address problems they've been ignoring." As Daisy's recovery progressed and Henry's medical appointment approached, he found himself sleeping better than he had in months. The weight of unaddressed problems, both veterinary and medical, had been lifted from his shoulders, replaced by the lighter burden of proper care and professional attention. The therapeutic blanket that covered Daisy had become a symbol of something larger than post-surgical care. It represented the comfort that comes from accepting help, the healing that begins when pride stops interfering with wisdom, and the strength that can only be found when you stop trying to carry every burden alone. 2 weeks after the surgery, on a morning when autumn had painted the Vermont hills in shades of gold and crimson, Caleb arrived at the farm carrying the lead rope that would determine whether Daisy's recovery had been successful. The worn leather rope, soft from decades of use, had guided countless animals around Henry's farm cattle to pasture, horses to water, and now, hopefully, Daisy back to soundness. The lead rope represented trust, guidance, and the invisible connection between caretaker and cared for. As Henry held the familiar weight of it in his hands, he thought about all the times he had used it to lead animals to safety, to comfort, to healing. Today, it would reveal whether his decision to accept help had come in time to save Daisy's mobility. "This is the moment of truth," Caleb said, his voice carrying professional optimism tempered by realistic caution. "If the surgery was successful, we should see a dramatic improvement in her gait." Henry's hands trembled slightly as he clipped the lead rope to Daisy's halter, the tremor having nothing to do with age and everything to do with nervousness. Sarah stood beside the paddock fence, her presence both moral support and witness to what they all hoped would be a triumph of modern veterinary medicine over months of neglect. "Take your time," Caleb advised. "Let her move at her own pace." Henry opened the stall door and stepped back, allowing Daisy to emerge into the barn aisle under her own power. For a moment, The massive horse stood still, as if testing her own sensations, evaluating the messages her body was sending about weight-bearing and balance. Then she took her first step. The difference was immediately apparent. Where before each movement had been careful and hesitant, now Daisy stepped forward with something approaching her old confidence. The severe limp that had characterized her movement for months was gone, replaced by only the slightest favoritism that Caleb had warned them to expect during the final stages of healing. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, her hands covering her mouth as tears sprang to her eyes. Henry felt his own throat tighten with emotion as he watched Daisy take another step, then another, each movement more fluid and natural than he had seen since the lameness began. The sight of his beloved horse walking normally again hit him with unexpected force relief, gratitude, and a profound sense of redemption, all mixing together in his chest. "How does she look to you?" Caleb asked, though his smile suggested he already knew the answer. "Like herself again," Henry managed, his voice rough with emotion. "Like the horse I remember." They moved slowly down the barn aisle toward the paddock, Daisy's hoofbeats creating a rhythm that sounded like music to Henry's ears. Each step confirmed what the previous one had suggested. The surgery had been successful. The foreign object that had caused months of pain was gone, and Daisy was on her way back to full soundness. As they emerged into the autumn sunlight, Daisy raised her head and nickered softly, a sound Henry hadn't heard from her in weeks. It was the same greeting she had offered every morning for 12 years, the vocal acknowledgement of their partnership that had been absent during the worst of her lameness. "She's telling us she feels better," Henry said, running his hand along Daisy's neck and feeling the relaxed muscle tone that indicated an absence of pain. "The improvement is remarkable," Caleb confirmed, watching Daisy's movement with the trained eye of a professional. "I'd say we're looking at about 90% soundness already, and she should continue to improve over the next few weeks." They walked a slow circuit around the familiar farm paths that Daisy knew by heart, past the vegetable garden where Martha's herbs still grew, around the pasture where the cattle grazed, and back toward the barn that had been home for 12 years. With each step, Henry felt his guilt and self-recrimination beginning to lift, replaced by something he hadn't felt in months: hope. "I can't believe the difference," Sarah said, walking beside them with obvious joy. "It's like watching a completely different horse." Henry nodded, unable to trust his voice as he watched Daisy move with increasing confidence. The sight of her recovery was more than just veterinary success. It was proof that his decision to accept help, painful as it had been to his pride, had been the right choice. As they completed their circuit and headed back toward the barn, Daisy's steps grew more animated, as if she were remembering what it felt like to move without pain. Henry felt a corresponding lightness in his own step, the burden of months of worry and guilt finally beginning to ease. The lead rope in his hands felt different now, not just a tool for guiding animals, but a symbol of the connection between those who care and those who need care. A reminder that sometimes the greatest strength comes from admitting vulnerability and accepting help. As they continued their walk around the farm, Henry's well-worn leatherwork boots carried him over paths he had traveled for half a century. These boots, resoled 3 times and bearing the scars of countless days of honest labor, represented a lifetime of determination, self-reliance, and the gradual accumulation of wisdom that comes from working close to the land. The boots had walked these same routes through every season: spring plantings when hope ran high, summer cultivation under blazing sun, autumn harvests that determined the farm's survival, and winter maintenance when the work never truly stopped. Now they carried Henry toward an understanding he had been years in reaching, that accepting limitations with grace was not defeat, but wisdom. "You know what this means, don't you?" Caleb said as they watched Daisy move with increasing confidence. She could easily have another decade of productive life ahead of her. The words hit Henry with unexpected impact. 10 more years of companionship. 10 more seasons of shared work. 10 more years of the steady presence that had anchored his life since Martha's death. The future, which had seemed clouded with loss and decline, suddenly opened up with possibilities he hadn't dared to consider. 10 years, Henry repeated, testing the idea like a man learning a new language. I'll be 83. And if you take care of yourself the way we're taking care of Daisy, there's no reason you can't be working this farm at 83. Caleb's voice carried the conviction of someone who had seen older farmers thriving through proper health care and realistic adaptation. Sarah moved closer to her father, slipping her arm through his in a gesture that reminded Henry of the way Martha used to walk with him during their evening strolls around the farm. Dad, yesterday, I was worried about how much longer you could manage this place alone. Today, I'm wondering if I need to start planning for you to outlive us all. The comment drew a genuine laugh from Henry, the first real laughter he had felt since Daisy's lameness began. The sound surprised him with its richness, reminding him that joy was still possible, that the future could hold more than just decline and loss. I've got my doctor's appointment next Tuesday, Henry said, the words coming easier now than they had a week ago. Dr. Peterson will probably find a dozen things wrong with me that I've been ignoring, and treating every one of them will be easier than what we just went through with Daisy, Caleb pointed out. High blood pressure responds to medication. Arthritis can be managed. Most of the health problems that affect people your age are completely treatable if you catch them early. Enough. As they walked, Henry found himself really looking at his farm for the first time in months, seeing it not through the lens of worry and impending loss, but with the eyes of someone who might have many more years to tend and improve it. The fence line that needed attention, the barn roof that could use reinforcement, the pastures that would benefit from reseeding. All of these tasks suddenly seemed like investments in the future rather than desperate attempts to hold back decay. Caleb, Henry said, stopping beside the paddock fence where Daisy was now grazing contentedly, I want to ask you something. Of course. Would you consider being the regular veterinarian for this farm? Not just for emergencies, but for routine care, preventive medicine, the kind of professional attention I should have been providing all along? Caleb's face lit up with obvious pleasure. I would be honored. This is exactly the kind of relationship I hope to build when I decided to specialize in large animal practice. Good, because I've learned something important these past few weeks. Henry paused, organizing thoughts that had been crystallizing since the moment Caleb extracted that rusted nail. Real independence isn't about never needing help. It's about being smart enough to get help when you need it, so you can stay independent longer. Sarah squeezed her father's arm, her eyes bright with tears of relief and pride. Mom would be so proud of you right now. She would also say it's about time I learned this lesson, Henry replied with a rueful smile. Martha always was smarter than me about these things. As they headed back toward the barn, Daisy walking between them with the easy gait of a sound horse, Henry felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Optimism about the future. The discovery that his own farrier work had caused Daisy's suffering had been devastating, but it had also taught him that even well-intentioned independence could become destructive isolation. The boots that carried him back to the barn had walked him through 50 years of farming, 47 years of marriage, and 5 years of widowhood. Now they were carrying him toward a new understanding of what it meant to be strong, what it meant to be independent, and what it meant to accept help with dignity rather than seeing it as defeat. Looking at Daisy's sound movement and thinking about his upcoming medical appointment, Henry realized that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from standing alone, but from having the wisdom to build the support systems that allow you to keep standing at all. 3 months later, on a crisp January morning, when the Vermont snow lay thick and clean across the rolling hills, Henry stood beside the farm's entrance installing a new wooden sign. The fresh pine board, hand-carved by a craftsman in town. Read Lathrop Farm, established 1973, renewed 2024, in simple, elegant letters that caught the winter sunlight. The new sign represented more than mere decoration. It symbolized Henry's acceptance that honoring tradition didn't require rejecting change, that acknowledging the past could coexist with embracing the future. The farm that his father had started and Henry had built was the same operation it had always been, but it was also something new, a place where wisdom had finally triumphed over stubborn pride. Daisy stood in the paddock behind him, her copper coat thick with winter growth, moving with the easy confidence of a completely sound horse. The months since her surgery had seen her return to full activity, pulling the manure spreader through the snow-covered fields, helping with the winter feeding routine, and providing the steady companionship that had anchored Henry's life for 12 years. "She looks like a different horse," Caleb said, approaching through the snow with his veterinary bag in hand. The monthly wellness visits had become routine, part of a preventive care program that Henry now understood was an investment in Daisy's long-term health rather than an unnecessary expense. "She feels like a different horse," Henry replied, watching Daisy toss her head playfully in the crisp air. "Sometimes I think she's trying to make up for all the months when she couldn't move properly." Caleb smiled, setting down his bag to examine the new sign. "I like this. Renewed captures exactly what's happened here." The renewal extended far beyond Daisy's recovery. Henry's medical checkup with Dr. Peterson had revealed high blood pressure and early signs of diabetes, both conditions that were easily manageable with medication and lifestyle changes, but both potentially serious if left untreated. The parallel to Daisy's situation hadn't been lost on anyone involved. "How are you feeling?" Caleb asked as they walked toward the barn together. "Better than I have in years," Henry answered honestly. "The blood pressure medication took some getting used to, but Dr. Peterson was right. I have more energy now than I've had in months." Sarah's car appeared in the driveway, right on schedule for their weekly lunch together, a tradition they had established as part of Henry's commitment to staying connected with family and community. She emerged carrying a covered dish and wearing the satisfied expression of a daughter who no longer worried constantly about her father's welfare. "How's the patient today?" she called out, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Ornery?" "As ever," Henry replied with a grin. "Both patients, actually." The joke had become a running theme in the months since the surgery. Henry and Daisy were both recovering patients, both learning to accept care and attention, both discovering that healing required patience and professional guidance. The parallel had helped Henry understand that seeking help wasn't a sign of aging or decline, it was a sign of wisdom. Inside the barn, Caleb conducted his monthly examination of Daisy with the thorough attention that had become his trademark. The surgical site had healed completely, leaving only a small scar that served as a reminder of how close they had come to permanent lameness. "Perfect," Caleb announced, straightening up from his examination. "I couldn't ask for better healing." "And the long-term prognosis?" "Excellent. With regular care and monitoring, she could easily work into her 20s. Caleb packed his instruments with practiced efficiency. "Of course, that assumes you keep up with regular veterinary visits." "You don't have to worry about that," Henry said firmly. "I've learned my lesson about putting off professional care." The farming community had embraced Caleb completely in the months since Daisy's surgery. Word of his skill and dedication had spread through the network of neighbors and friends that connected rural Vermont, and his practice had grown steadily as older farmers overcame their initial skepticism about his youth and inexperience. "Speaking of which," Caleb said, "Tom Morrison asked me to thank you for the recommendation. His cattle are doing much better since we started the new vaccination program." Henry nodded with satisfaction. He had become something of an unofficial ambassador for Caleb's services, sharing his story with other farmers who might be hesitant to call a young veterinarian. The role felt natural and important, a way of giving back to the community that had supported him through difficult times. As they prepared to head inside for lunch, Henry paused to look at his farm one more time, the snow-covered fields where Daisy would help with spring planting, the barn where 3 generations of his family had worked and worried and celebrated, the hills that rolled away toward distant mountains like a promise of continuity. "You know what I realized?" Henry said to Caleb and Sarah as they stood together in the winter sunshine. "All those years I thought asking for help would make me look weaker and incompetent. Instead, it's made me feel stronger than I have in years." "How so?" Sarah asked. "Because now I know that if something goes wrong with Daisy, with me, with the farm, I don't have to handle it alone. I have people I can call, people who care enough to help." Henry gestured toward the new sign that proclaimed the farm's renewal. "That's not dependence. That's community." As they walked toward the farmhouse for lunch, Henry felt the deep satisfaction that comes from understanding a fundamental truth about life, that the strongest people aren't those who never need help, but those who have the wisdom to accept it gracefully and the generosity to offer it freely in return. The farm would continue, as it had for 50 years, but now it would continue with the support and care that Henry had finally learned to accept. Sometimes the hardest person to help really is the one who's spent a lifetime helping others. But once that barrier is overcome, the rewards for everyone involved are immeasurable.